Madam President, American families are struggling with the cost of living. And one of the biggest challenges they face is the incredibly high cost of prescription drugs. Now, last week, President Trump signed a new executive order that tries to implement international reference pricing on prescription drugs for Americans. At his press conference, President Trump called out pharmaceutical companies for, quote, price gouging, which he described as, quote, a great American ripoff. Madam President, I agree with President Trump. Prescription drugs are too expensive in America, and we are getting ripped off. And there is no reason that pharmaceutical companies should charge American patients more than they charge people in other countries. And these excessive price gouging practices have forced many Americans to pay 4 times or 5 times, even 6 times for the same life-saving medications as folks in other countries pay. There's absolutely no justification for that. Now, in the last Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act was a significant step towards combating Big Pharma's price gouging and lowering prices for American patients. That act allowed Medicare the ability to negotiate drug prices for the first time ever. By the way, that's something that all other countries do. They protect their citizens from price gouging. That bill meant 20,000 Vermonters who take 1 or more of the first 10 drugs selected by Medicare for negotiation will see lower prices starting in 2026. That can't come soon enough. Over 27,000 Vermonters will save an average of $600 annually, thanks to the $2,000 annual out-of-pocket cost cap that began in January of 2025. The Inflation Reduction Act will save senior Vermonters on Medicare a total of more than $21 million on prescription drugs. But when you're the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry, you've got a lot of tricks up your sleeve to thwart any policy that cuts into your profits. One of Big Pharma's favorite refrains is that reference pricing, where we pay essentially the same as everybody else pays, not 5 times more, will put a strain on research and innovation. That is false. The fact of the matter is that over 2 decades, the world's largest biopharmaceutical companies have spent way more on advertising and way more on administrative costs, including, by the way, multi-million-dollar CEO pay packages, than they have spent on research and development. And by the way, what they do spend on research and development is subsidized by taxpayers. So while pharma is doing these maneuvers to keep prices up, real people are hurting. On average, Americans spend over $1,400 on prescription drugs every year. That's the highest per capita spending in the world. And it's one of the reasons why healthcare costs are so high. By the way, not just with the cost for Medicaid and Medicare, but for employers who care about their employees and are fighting against ever-increasing insurance premiums that makes that almost out of reach, or makes them make a decision between increasing pay, which workers want and workers need, and maintaining health care benefits that workers want and workers need. And you know, there's a part of this that I think is really sad and particularly cruel on the part of pharma. They have this incredible pricing power that comes in part because of the patent that they are granted. It comes in part because there is a market that's created through taxpayers with Medicare and Medicaid. But it is exploited because what pharma knows is what you and I know. If a member of your family, if your partner, a person you love, is in need of a medication, you'll do whatever it takes. You'll get a second mortgage if you have a home. You'll postpone getting a car that you need. You'll go into your retirement savings, whatever it takes. So this predatory practice of taking advantage of the love one American has for another to exploit on the pricing side is, in my view, quite outrageous. But the cruelty of this situation is that you can have folks in Vermont, just miles from the border in Canada, where right over across the border, folks are paying 5 times less than what we pay on the Vermont side of the border. And I've heard from so many folks, and I'll bet you've heard similar stories, Madam President, who've told me the story of dealing with, in this case, type 1 diabetes, and they're trying to get their mental health back in a better place. The medication they were put on at the beginning of the year was helping, but the cost more than tripled suddenly, and they can't afford to pay $800 a month, yet they're worried about a relapse. And that story isn't unique. Everyday folks in Vermont and in red and blue states across the country are paying more for their drugs than the same folks are paying for in other countries. And by the way, one of the things that I find so compelling about this is we agree, both sides of the aisle, that costs for Americans are too high. We agree, both sides of the aisle, that folks need health care. And we do agree, most of us, that the pharma prices are way too high. So this is something, in my view, we can and should do together. The Inflation Reduction Act has reined in pharma's abusive tactics, but only minimally, by forcing them to the table for the first time. That's good, but we need to do more. You know, Trump's executive order is implying the poke it with a stick strategy, announcing a new policy and waiting to see what happens. His new executive order will face the same practical challenges this time around as it did in Trump's first administration, from pharmaceutical companies looking to obscure their pricing margins. You know, they tell us how tough times are, even as on the phone calls with Wall Street analysts, they're saying how wonderful times are. And we have to face up to that in order, as Congress, to support a lower price approach, which includes negotiation and includes reference pricings. You know, patients across the country who can't afford these drugs need it now. They need them now, not in 10 years. And you know, the American people, they do want action in lowering prescription drug prices. And for the life of every person I talk to in Vermont, and I'm sure this is true with the folks you talk to in Florida, they just can't understand why we have to pay 5 times more than folks in other countries. And they particularly can't understand it when our taxpayers have provided much of the funding for research that went into the creation of these drugs in the first place. I'm very proud to join with my colleague from Missouri, Senator Hawley, in introducing bipartisan legislation that will offer relief for millions of patients by prohibiting pharmaceutical companies from selling drugs here in the United States at higher prices than the international average. Very basic, very fair. Our bill will put an end to Big Pharma's practice of forcing Americans to pay the highest prices in the world for medications. The bottom line is that President Trump has issued an executive order that I support. My hope is that he's going to follow through, because we are going to need the leadership of the President of the United States and the influence he has in Congress to get us on both sides of this Capitol to get international reference pricing and to make more progress on price negotiation, all for the goal of making life-saving medications more accessible to folks on Medicare, folks on Medicaid, to folks who have private insurance, and also to bring down the cost for our employers who are facing relentless upward spikes in healthcare premiums. So I'll extend the same challenge to President Trump that he extended to the pharmaceutical companies. Let's get real. As President Trump put it in his inimitable way, don't get cute about avoiding the responsibility we have to bring down prescription drug prices. So I call on my colleagues and I call on President Trump to follow words with actions. We've got to follow through on this debate. We know how to do it, to bring down big pharma's prices and stand up to their greed and support the Welch bill to ensure that no one in America ever faces an impossible choice between paying for prescriptions that they need or putting food on the table or paying the rent or fixing a broken down car. Madam President, I yield back.